Our last presenter will be Rosabel Ansari. Dr. Ansari is a fellow of the Institute for Global Studies and lecturer in Asian and Asian American Studies at Stony Brook University, SUNY. Her forthcoming book is entitled Al-Farabi and the Ambiguity of Being, and her published articles cover various aspects of metaphysics in the post-Avicennan tradition. So Dr. Ansari's presentation is titled Climate Change and a Specific Evil, and Avicennan reading. Please.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see the screen and hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to keep this under 30 minutes, hopefully 20 to 25 minutes in the interest of time. Thank you, Dr. Farouk and Dr. Rustam for inviting me. And particular thanks to Dr. Rustam for encouraging me to move into more constructive and contemporary thought. Thank you, Dr. Maysami, for chairing this panel. So my talk is on climate change and specific evil and Avicennan reading. Increasingly recognized as an existential threat to human life, global climate change has captured the world's attention more than ever before in the last, let's say, 4 years. From politics and activism to media and popular culture to business investment, a growing current among human societies is recognizing the threat of climate change as a looming emergency. For the first time, these currents stretch beyond the confines of scientists and focused environmentalist groups. So what I want to talk about today is the shift in the last few years towards language that describes climate change as an emergency and also as an existential threat to human life, posing a threat to our very existence on the planet. And how we can make sense of this within the philosophical system of Avicenna, a medieval Islamic philosopher. The name Ibn Sina in Arabic has already come up a couple of times in this panel. Ibn Sina, following a traditional Aristotelian framework, believed that the species are eternal. So not only is the world eternal, but species are eternal. And he also believed that evil can only afflict individual members of a species. So evil can only afflict individual humans. It cannot afflict all of humankind together at once. So my talk today is to try to flesh out, well, what would Avicenna have to say about climate change as posing a threat to the existence of the entire human species. This language of existential threat really took off with the report published in 2018 by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is the front page of the report. This came out in 2018, and it talked about the real necessity to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. It talked about the cataclysmic effects, catastrophic effects on the world if global warming goes above that amount. And if we do nothing, if we just continue to live as we are, global warming is actually predicted to be 4 degrees centigrade, which would be, the 4 degrees would be the 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And if that were to happen, probably by the end of the century, there's a real chance that the world would become uninhabitable for humans. But to keep climate change to only 1.5 degrees Celsius would require massive, massive changes to the way we live, including cutting emissions by 50% by the year 2030. We're now in 2022 and we're not nowhere near close to that. In fact, emissions are continuing to rise. And so that has led to this language of existential threat. And that this damning report that was published in 2018 is also accompanied by a growing body of scientific evidence that's showing the effects climate change is already having on life on the planet. So I'm going to go through a few examples of that. I'm then going to give some examples of the language of existential threat, and then I'll talk about how that's already affecting human behavior. And then I'll move into the Avicenna section. So some of the things scientists are talking about is that human habitats and sometimes entire countries are already slated to become unlivable, even within the 1.5 degrees centigrade framework. So for example, Kuwait was in the news last year, and it's also been the subject of scientific studies, that it is very soon going to become unlivable. They say by the end of the century that being outdoors in Kuwait could be life-threatening. Last year, there were reports in the news that birds were falling from the skies in Kuwait because it got so hot. It got to 53.2 degrees Celsius last summer in Kuwait, which is equivalent to 127.8 degrees Fahrenheit. There were also talks of seahorses boiling in the bays in Kuwait last summer. Rising sea levels, entire countries are going to be, they're said to disappear, go underwater, specifically the Pacific Island nations by the end of the century. Even within the 1.5 degrees framework, there's a significant chance that could happen. These increased temperatures and the melting of the polar ice caps not only lead to the rising sea levels, but also to the melting of permafrost, which some of you have probably already heard about in the news, which will release even more carbon dioxide. And that will even more increase temperatures, leading to even more extreme weather events, and the cycle will continue to get worse and worse. Also been scientific studies about how increased temperatures are decreasing fertility through things like toxicity of wildfire fumes. We have more and more fires now. That leads to decreased fertility, and increased temperatures also lead to higher maternal mortality simply due to the heat exhaustion. So these are just some of the things that are leading people to talk more about existential threat. One of a big academic publication that came out 2 months ago, this one, Global Climate Change, published this year. You can see the editors. I've got now here the table of contents, just to give you a sense. So it's a huge tome, massive, massive book. These are all the different chapters in there. And the second chapter after the introduction I put in bold is on the existential threats of climate change. So I was actually just reading that over the last couple of days. It's 30 pages, very summary form of all the different scientific research that shows the different threats to human life and life in general on the planet. So who else is talking about this language of existential threat? It's becoming more and more common among youth, activist voices, in particular spearheaded by the, I think, Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. We had this young lady here. In 2019, she started to talk about mass extinction. So this was here. I'm gonna do a couple of clips. Each one is going to be very short, just to hear her talk very emotionally about the threat of mass extinction on the planet.
This is all wrong.
Forward to.
I shouldn't be up here.
This is her speaking to the United
I should
Nations.
be back at school on the other side. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
So that was her in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit. She's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, I think 3 times. And she has continued to talk about this threat of mass extinction. Another group that kind of embody this language actually is a group that originated in the UK called Extinction Rebellion, spread around the world.
This is all wrong.
Sorry. Next slide. This is the front page of their website and how they describe themselves as a decentralized, international, and politically nonpartisan movement using nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. to persuade governments to act justly on the climate and ecological emergency. So as you can see, they call themselves Extinction Rebellion. I guess the way they see it is they're trying to rebel against what will be extinction of life on that planet if we do nothing. So they describe themselves as using non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. If you read the news about them, their detractors will use quite different language to describe them. They are willing to risk imprisonment. Thousands of these activists have been arrested over the last couple of years. They plan events that are designed to disrupt life, disrupt functioning of society in order to bring people's attention to what is going on. Their detractors would say that they promote lawlessness, right? They promote ignoring laws. But they would say it's not time to worry about the legality of disruptive behavior when human life is threatened with extinction due to our own making. According to their view, rebellion is the sole mechanism for human salvation as we move towards the point of no return. So that's a phrase they'll use often, is point of no return, on the precipice of no return. So this is just a couple of images of some of the type of imagery they create in their protests. So here on the left, this was them at the Glasgow Climate Conference in November 2021, so just a few months ago. You can see this, it says here, while Earth burns, and we're on the edge of the abyss, and they are soaked in red paint, I guess to symbolize blood, that we are dying. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this is supposed to be somebody dressed up as the Grim Reaper. It's written here, fossil fuels. So with the burning of fossil fuels, we are killing ourselves, we're killing our environment. There were more images I collected of scenes that are really designed to be disruptive behavior. But I focused on these two because it shows the symbolism of the Grim Reaper and the blood, I think, it shows what the message they're trying to get across. So this language of existential threat is also being used by politicians and world leaders. So it began in 2018 with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So this is, I'm just going to show you him. This is him. This is from 2018. I think this is when that report came out, the one I began with. Oh. Okay.
Every day, I'm faced with the challenges of our troubled and complex world, but none of them loom so large as climate change. If we fail to meet the challenge, all our other challenges will just become greater and threaten to swallow us. Climate change is quite simply an existential threat for most life on the planet, including and especially the life of humankind.
Okay, so that was back in 2018. Climate change is going to swallow us, and it is an existential threat for the life of mankind. This was then echoed in 2021 by US President Joe Biden at the Glasgow Conference of Climate Change that I mentioned earlier. So just quickly, this is the last
My
clip.
friends, if we're to recognize that a better, more hopeful future for every nation has to do its part, with ambitious targets to keep 1.5 degrees in reach, and specific plans on how to get there, especially the major economies. It's imperative that we support developing nations so they can be our partners in this effort. Right now, we're still falling short. There's no more time to hang back or sit on the fence or argue amongst ourselves. This is a challenge of our collective lifetimes, the existential threat to human existence as we know it.
There we go. So again, no more time, running out of time, we're facing an existential threat. And finally, the last example I want to give of this language is really symbolic language from popular culture. This was introduced to me by my Stony Brook students. The Netflix film, Don't Look Up, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but Again, this is actually the interpretation of my students, not mine, but according to my students at Stony Brook, this film, which is it's about a meteorite that comes to hit Earth, that scientists discover, and people are the politicians and general population is in complete denial that this meteorite is going to hit the Earth. It's said to be so big that it will destroy life. And everybody's in denial about it until they can see it and it's literally coming to hit the Earth, at which point a few group of super rich people get into a spacecraft and leave the Earth, and everybody else dies. So according to my students, this is actually supposed to be symbolic of what's happening in the world right now, with the meteorite being climate change and most people being in denial about it, leading their lives as normal. And really it's about to come and destroy all life, and nobody's gonna really think about it until it's too late. And you can see here, it says on the bottom right corner, based on truly possible events. So apparently this is supposed to get people thinking. So this existential threat discourse goes beyond words and talk. It is also tied to it's also becoming a part of human behavior as well. I'm sure everybody's been reading about increase in anxiety among young people. My interest in this topic really grew from, again, my students telling me that they sometimes stay up at night worrying about climate change. The global green technology and sustainability market was valued at 10.31 billion in 2021. It's projected to reach 74.64 billion by 2030. So those numbers really speak to the growing concern. Also, there's a growing tide of anti-natalism, people saying it's unethical to have children because of climate change. So I'll stop there with those examples because I really want to move on to the Avicenna section of the paper. So, as I said, Avicenna believes in eternity of the species, right? And that obviously applies to the eternity of human species. Human beings cannot go extinct according to Avicenna's system. His theory of, he discusses this and generally the theory of evil in the chapter on providence in Metaphysics of the Healing. As Khalil actually mentioned earlier, that Islamic discussions on evil come in chapters on providence. Okay, I was going to say a little bit about why it's interesting to study this, but I'll skip that section. On the surface, Avicenna's views might seem like armchair philosophy in comparison to what we now know about the natural world, right? Things like eternity of the species. Arguing not only that evil is always outweighed by the good, Avicenna maintains that evil can only afflict individuals and not the species as such, right? So he doesn't seem to leave any room for the possibility of the human species facing an existential threat. I'll explain a little bit about how the theory of providence and evil works. So this is just some basic points that come up in Metaphysics 9.6. So according to this chapter, the governance of the universe and being itself, wujud itself, is governed by the order of the good that emanates from the first that emanates from God in the manner that is most complete and most conducive to order. Right? So this is the structure of the universe, is in accordance with the order of the good. Evil is then defined, right, as the privation of what is necessary for a species. But because the world is governed by the order of the good, evil can only afflict members of a species at certain times. It cannot afflict the whole, right? Because that would conflict with the doctrine that the world is governed by the order of the good. Towards the end of Metaphysics 9.6, Avicenna concludes that due to the states of the world, some evil is necessary, right, in individuals, right? So he actually says there has to be some evil, but it's only ever accidental. It's not intended in and of itself. It's just an accident of what becomes the overall order of the good. Okay, I'll skip a little bit. And then, okay, so we have this kind of conundrum of how would Avicenna make sense of the existential threat of climate change? This brings me to kind of the final part of the talk. Potential solution I see would be in Avicenna's theory of evil acts. Okay, This is also in Metaphysics 9.6. So even if Avicenna does not appear to discuss anything that could give us a solution to existential threat of climate change, through his discussion of evil acts, he does provide an important gateway into thinking about human-induced climate change, right? Because the whole premise of the climate change discussion today is that it's human-induced, right? It's the result of evil acts that we are committing as a species, or that members of our species are committing. So Avicenna tells us that evil acts are those that cause an individual or polity to lose their perfection. His examples would be adultery, which causes an individual to lose his perfection, or injustice, which would cause a polity, right, a state or a group of people to lose their perfection. He then explains that evil acts are in some way also perfections for the things that cause them. So although we might say injustice is overall an imperfection or a loss of perfection for a polity, it is still a perfection for what caused that injustice. So in this case, it would be what Avicenna calls the irascible power, which is the desire in human being to subjugate. Now, there are times when the desire to subjugate could be good, right? So injustice or subjugation, let's say, it sometimes might be good. So in that case, injustice is a perfection for the power of the irascible power. But that doesn't mean that overall it's good, right? So he then talks about the burning of a poor man's garment. Right? So if you had a poor man who only possessed one garment, or anybody's garment, burning it would be evil. Particularly the garment of a poor man, it would be evil. But these these individual instances of evil, Avicenna concludes, are necessary for preservation of the universal order, right, which I mentioned before, the universal order of the good. So even acts of injustice must in some way contribute to the universal order of the good. So while the existential threat of climate change may not have been conceivable to Avicenna, his theory of providence, the order of the good, and evil acts may help us to make sense of it, especially with regard to the human-induced aspect of the climate emergency. Right, so so I'll just explain what I mean by that. The most basic and primary perfection of the human species, in particular of the vegetative soul, is the perpetuation of existence, right, which is through nutrition and reproduction, right? So we need to eat to preserve our lives, we need to reproduce to preserve the species, right? This is one of the basic perfections of being human or of any living creature. So that desire for consumption, right, is something necessary. We need to consume to live. But if our desire for consumption, what Avicenna calls the appetitive power, is so strong that it leads to the destruction of our habitat, right? In Avicennan terms, such a situation is the privation or the loss of our primary perfection by the very powers in the soul that ought to produce it. Right? So the desire for consumption should preserve our souls, but in this case, we seem to have this a never-ending desire for consumption that somehow then leads us to destroy ourselves, at least within this framework of human-induced climate change. The perfection of the appetitive power, the desire for consumption in individuals, thus cumulatively leads to evil in the privation of habitat for the entire species, and ultimately threatens the existence of the species. Is it possible then to see this within the order of the good? That's not something that Avicenna himself would have argued for, right? Because Avicenna believes the species must be eternal, limiting evil to the affliction of individuals. But if human beings themselves have induced an existential threat through evil acts, it would seem to go against Avicenna's theory of providence that governs the universe, unless we take the exceptional position that the possible end of the human species is what will fulfill the order, that will fulfill the good in the universal order. This is not something that Avicenna would say, but there could be a couple of ways to work this out. obviously we could have some sort of redemption. Practically, the appetitive powers of individuals must be subdued before overconsumption destroys human habitat. Ultimately, the rational soul would emerge to fulfill its own perfection, right? The rationality within us, by subduing the appetitive power, by subduing this desire for consumption in individuals, either through education, hopefully, or through the sheer force of regulation. If this subduing of the appetitive powers and desire for consumption does not take place, then the human race does face a possible extinction, at least according to this discourse of climate change and existential threat. And then the Avicennan philosophy would be at a deadlock on this issue, unless we accept that human self-destruction is a part of the order of the good. Either we need to regulate our consumption or be satisfied that the loss of our habitat is necessary for the order of the good, i.e. we need to destroy ourselves. We are still left with the problem of evil afflicting the entire species as opposed to individuals. But maybe one thing I started thinking of is maybe maybe we could see this existential threat and the destruction of our habitat as actually only affecting individuals, that cumulatively adds up to all individuals, but that might be separate from the species itself. Maybe there's a way to make sense of that with Avicenna. I think, how am I doing for time? I think I'll stop here just to leave a little bit of time for questions so we don't go too over.
You still have like 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll wrap up then. So Avicenna says that we cannot have, you can't have evil afflicting the species as such, but you can have evil afflicting individuals. So the one solution I found to this maybe would be to say that when climate change, if it does indeed lead to an existential threat to human life on the planet, maybe we could say it's still not affecting the species as such. It's only affecting individuals within the species, right? That cumulatively adds up to all human beings. But somehow maybe we could separate that, like all individuals maybe could be different to the species as such. This might be a way to preserve the integrity of Avicenna's system and also accommodate for climate change. And accommodate for the existential threat of climate change, which, as I said, wouldn't usually make sense within his system. But that's the only way I can try to square the two issues, other than obviously the redemption and the practical ethics of subduing this desire for consumption that somehow seems to be leading to our own self-destruction. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your multimedia presentation. So as for the questions, well, there are a couple of great comments and evidence somehow from verses of the Quran. The one question I see here is looking at the table of temperatures over the last 150 years as determined by climatologists and archaeologists alike, we noticed the strangest spike in world temperatures on a scale of several thousand years. This period corresponds exactly with the short time during which a handful of Western states have succeeded in dominating the world economy. What are your thoughts? So just the political relevance of the issue, if you would like to make a comment on that. It's up to you.
The fact that it's Western states' dominance that has coincided with the rising temperatures?
Yeah, I believe the question suggests that the way that, yes, the way that things are progressing with respect to the handling of, let's say, evil in the world, including climate change, can you relate it to this dominating attitude? Yeah, that I think you also mentioned that with also the example of the movie Look Up, the question that there is a dominating class and might be gaining from this somehow. That's my understanding. So what do you think of that?
Oh yeah, I
You agree,
completely agree. I mean, this comes from a deep sickness in our Western societies, our underlying philosophies, consumption, domination. I mean, the capitalism, the lack of balance and harmony with the world that we live in. I honestly, I could go on. I don't know if I don't know. I don't really want to say too much that I haven't thought through, but I mean, this is something we could talk about for hours. I mean, this is all
Yes,
entirely
true.
down to the sickness of our civilization, really, that has led to this self-destruction.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's enough for now. But as you said, this can continue for a long time, the discussion. So next is, does Avicenna say that the species are not affected because of his belief that universals are immutable and particulars are perishable? Is that the natural offshoot of his Neoplatonic philosophical system? I think you referred to his Aristotelian background, but you can say more if you like.
The universals are immutable.
Yeah.
And
that the species cannot go extinct. Is it because of his belief in the immutability of universals?
Yeah, I mean, the two things are kind of parallel, but I don't think they're related, because the eternity of the species and generally the eternity of the world, that comes more out of, well, his natural science and his view that the world has to be co-eternal with God, because there could not be a moment in time that God created the world, because that would imply a change in God. So that actually, the immutability of the species is a part of the eternity of the world, which actually relates back to Avicenna's theology and theory of causation. Whereas, on the other hand, the immutability of universals, that's in some ways parallel, because intelligible, that's the idea that what's intelligible is real and true and eternal. So it's kind of parallel, because anything that's real and true has to be eternal. But it's not because of that he thinks the human species is eternal. They both kind of similar ideas that come from.
Yeah. I think Albert might have probably natural universals in mind. I'm not sure, but anyways, we can move on. Thank you so much. And the next question goes, does the Avicenna's idea of human species, idea that human species is imperishable, mean that human species is to continue living on Earth forever? How does that relate to eschatology and end of the world?
Yeah, in my understanding, and this is definitely not my specialism, but my understanding is, yes, it does mean that the human species would continue living on Earth forever. As regards to Avicenna's eschatology and end of the world, I know he takes a lot of eschatology to be metaphorical, not real.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I won't say more on that.
Thank you so much. I see Dr. Farouk's hands up. I bet you want to tell us about natural universals.
No, that discussion, I don't know whether you remember, we had this meeting at American Philosophical Association a few years ago. Muhammad Azadpour was there, about natural universal. We need a special, coffee and shisha and everything for this. It's not, just don't want to get into that. Sorry, I was just kidding. Thank you for that talk. So I have a few interrelated questions. So as you mentioned, climate change is an existential threat. So I was just wondering the kind of cause and root cause of this threat, like, where did it originate? Because there seems to be a lot of these books by people like, Caroline Merchant, writing about the death of nature, and Sayyidu and Nasser, even Lynn White, grounding this in a particular conception of nature during the scientific revolution, where we began to have these mechanistic conceptions of nature and so forth. So so my first question is, do you think this has to do with how we relate to nature, how we view nature? Does it really matter we see nature in a quantified form as an object, or it's more organic? There's an interrelatedness between all beings, and that's really a matter. So this brings me to also Avicenna's conception of nature, whether when it comes to Avicenna's views on nature, whether there's something he can contribute to the current discussion. So that's my first the first two questions. And the last question is about evil as privation, which is which is what all of these people, including Avicenna and other philosophers, by and large, they accept. It's a Neoplatonic principle. But today, a lot of philosophers criticize this idea by saying that while it does seem to explain some form of evil, especially natural evil, but it does not address personal suffering, especially if you're thinking of what some people call, as I mentioned before, horrendous, evil, evil that seems to befall innocent people and so forth. So how would you address that as well from an Avicennan perspective?
I just wrote down the questions.
You have the right to pick one of them, I believe.
I
Yes.
want to answer all of them. Well, I didn't quite catch the second question, so in the interest of time, I'll just answer the first and the third. The third I don't have much to say on, so I'll answer the first. Does this have to do with how we relate to nature? Is nature an object, or is it interrelated with us? That's how I wrote down some notes. That's a really profound question and really important. So I think I need to think this through and incorporate it into my paper. I think actually some of our response to the climate emergency, some of the activism actually, ironically, does treat nature as an object, right? And does treat nature as something quantifiable. So what we might say is like the good guys, they are definitely doing that. Does the problem in its beginning, did it start that way? Maybe, but I think it was not really, I don't think it was our understanding of nature that started the problem. I think it was the lack of concern, almost like lack of thought. Like there is no, like there's only us, like maybe an egocentrism, like what we need, what we want, what we can use, almost like like nature was not really even an object for anything other than our own use. But this is something I need to think more about. So I'm glad you brought it up. And then you mentioned like about, could we maybe see nature as something we're interrelated with rather than as an object? That is definitely the more, maybe the more harmonious approach that would probably lead to like a fundamental change in how we view the world and our place in it, that would lead to the healthiest solution or fixing of this current problem. But that's not something that is easy to do activism on, right? I think like activists focus on the nature as an object approach because it's the easiest way to get change. And the whole language is all about emergency, right? We're on the edge, we're dying. Like this is, like we need to do something right now. So I think then it kind of comes down to like the nature of activism and the nature of change. How do we change human behavior in society? So thank you. And then just briefly on the third question, how would Avicenna address suffering? Because evil as privation doesn't really address suffering. It might be important to think about Avicenna on emotions here. This is not something I've worked on. I don't know too much about Avicenna on emotions, obviously, other than the basic stuff that we teach in Avicenna's psychology. But definitely evil is privation, and it's just taking away our primary perfection. It does not address suffering at all. But maybe it would be in the philosophy of emotions that might come out. So I want to give him some room there. Maybe we'd have to come back to that. Maybe I could also add that into the paper too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosabel, and thank you, Dr. Farrow, for your questions. Well, we have a few minutes left. I think I can ask my question now, if that's okay. So I was actually inspired by the idea, by Avicenna's idea that universal evil, he does not actually attribute evil to the universal order. And it's like purifying universal order of evil. And in relation to all the discussions that we've had during these panels about God's place in this, God's role in this. And with this premise that for Avicenna, God's knowledge is also of the universal order. So can we conclude that God has does not even have knowledge of evil in the world. So not only he would be somehow exonerated of any role in evil, but also of even having knowledge of the evil. So if there's suffering or evil, God doesn't know what's going on to particular people. So there's no need to just think of why a benevolent God would tolerate all that. What do you think of this?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And I think this is something I've talked about it a lot with my students. I had a student last semester, an amazing student actually, who I hope all of you will get to know. He's going to work with John Woolbridge next year. He put Avicenna on trial last year in one of my classes. He gave a presentation where he talked about, and this is something I've talked about a lot in class, Avicenna's God doesn't really care about humans. There isn't really a mutual relationship. Avicenna says, I think, that God does not love human beings, right? Love is the yearning for something else, and well, God does not yearn for us. And I think he even begins the chapter on providence when he's talking about this order of the good, that the world is according to the order of the good, but not because God cares about the world, right? He actually rules that out. So does God have much to say? Does God have concern for human suffering in Avicenna's philosophy? I would say no. But going back to Mohammed Farouk's question, that doesn't mean he has nothing to say about suffering for human self-development. I mean, that probably does come up in his philosophy of emotions, but the very first point of your question is, does God even know about evil and suffering? I think that maybe God might know about evil, because when Avicenna talks about the order of the good emanating from God, he does mention that evil is a part of that. So God presumably knows that there are privations, but that doesn't mean that God knows or is interested in the suffering aspect of it, right? But knowledge of because he says that the privation in the system is necessary for the order of the good. So presumably God knows about it in a universal sense, that there is privation. Maybe, I don't know, but definitely I don't think suffering is relevant in Avicenna's theology.
Okay, I think Dr. Farouk, did you want to say something?
Maybe just a few seconds. So I would respectfully disagree. I think Avicenna does talk very clearly about the relationship between about the relationship of love between God and humans, especially if you look at Isharat. I think it's in Namat 10 or 9. Clearly, he talks about also the yearning from God's angle, also in the Salafil. So maybe we can have a further discussion about that later on. But I would say that Avicenna would definitely leave a lot of room for this kind of relationship between humans, but you can disagree.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have to talk about that, because I also had the exact same passage in mind that you have. So we would have to definitely look at that.
Yeah, follow up. Yes.
And by the way, I would like to change my mind, because I actually do love Avicenna. So.
Me too, and a lot of interpretations.
Yeah, if you can change my mind, I would be grateful.
Thank you, Rosabel, and thank you all the panelists and participants.